Water, water everywhere, and no place to live on the United States shorelines is the name of a recent 6-foot by 15-foot painting by renowned artist Michael Killen and this show's namesake. And it's also going to be the topic of today's conversation with Steve Zornetzer, our special guest and a really good friend of the Killen Report. Steve has his PhD from UC Irvine in neurobiology and neurosciences and was the Associate Center Director of Research and Technology at NASA's Ames Research Center. He is currently the Vice Chair of the Arctic Ice Project and a scientific staff member of Secure the Future 2100. I am Jonathan Kleid, a regular host of the Killen Report social media discussion show, and I'm also the president of Kleid Design Group Fine Custom Cabinetry in Oakland, California. Steve, welcome. It's good to be with you again.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's good to be back.
Now, I have to tell you, I'm going to try to include the C in Arctic. One of our viewers commented that I occasionally drop that, so I'm going to try to not get that comment this time around. So let's dive right into it. We all know that global warming is threatening our future, and certainly we can see what it's doing already. It's causing, certainly more wildfires and severe droughts, and just extreme weather events, I think, in general. So today I'd like to talk with you about something maybe less talked about, and that's global warming and sea level rise. So would you be so kind as to connect the dots for me and all of our viewers and talk about the relationship between global warming and its impacts on the ocean?
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I'd be happy to. So just by way of introduction here, I mean, we're all aware, as you've said, that global warming is occurring. It's becoming more and more profound around the world. We see every day on the news, we see examples of it. I think probably something we don't realize is how important the Arctic is in its contributions to global warming. So if we can see the first slide, and I just for your audience, I thought I'd use a number of graphics today because they do make the point rather dramatically that we're trying to talk about today. So here's a Mercator view of the planet Earth, our home planet, the only planet we have. And this rather interesting graphic shows the fact that the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. The lighter colors here, you can see the color bar down on the bottom, which gives us a reference point. So relative to the period from 1950 to 1980, before global warming really began to manifest itself very obviously on the planet, that was serving as a baseline. And these color changes represent increased temperature relative to that period of time. The white areas, the blue areas, the yellow areas represent lower increases in temperature. The very dark red areas represent higher increases in temperature. Overall, on the planet, the temperature has risen on average about 1.2 degrees centigrade since about 1980 or so. But you'll notice in this graphic that the areas of the planet that are heating up the most is the Arctic region. And there we see temperatures, average increase in temperatures compared to the 1980 timeframe of about 7 degrees warmer. I mean, that's very, very profound warming in the Arctic. And that's having incredible consequences. We can go into the reasons why that's happening. Physicists and geophysicists understand the reasons why. I don't think we need to go into that right now. That's not the point of our conversation today. But suffice it to say that now the Arctic, because of its tremendous rate of warming, has become a contributor to what previously has been thought of as greenhouse gas-driven global warming. We all know that CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases trap heat, and that's what's been contributing to global warming. That's all true. But now, since the Arctic has warmed so much due to greenhouse gas-driven climate change, it now has become a contributor to global warming and not just a consequence of global warming. And recent research has shown that perhaps as much as 40% of the total global warming that's occurring around the planet is now being contributed to by increased heating of the Arctic. This is profound and astounding. So the Arctic is now a problem for global warming, not just a consequence of it. It's actually helping to cause more accelerated global warming. So next slide shows you in some sort of an interesting way what some of the consequences of this is when you're on the ground in the Arctic. You can see on the left-hand side a polar bear being very happy in his normal cold Arctic environment. And on the right-hand side, what's happening to a species like the polar bear in the Arctic? The ice is melting, and particularly in the summer, when the sun shines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The ice that's covering the Arctic Ocean has been melting dramatically. It's reduced by 50 or 60% from what it was just 30 or 40 years ago, and current projections are that all of the Arctic sea ice during the summer months will be lost sometime around 2030, about 10 years from now. That's pretty astounding, because now the Arctic will be absorbing even more of solar energy and heat from the sun that warms the planet. So that's just going to further accelerate global warming if we don't do something about it. Over the last 2,500 years, sea level rise has been remarkably constant. And it's been that way until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So in about mid-19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, there have been no changes in sea level rise. And then as humans began to burn more and more fossil fuels in ever increasing amounts and putting more and more CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the climate began to warm more and more, and the Arctic began to melt and get warmer. And Arctic ice, both sea ice and land ice and snow, began to melt more and more. That meltwater is into either the Arctic Ocean or the North Atlantic or the Pacific, depending on where the oceans come close to the Arctic. So sea level has begun to rise. We know today that the average increase in temperature around the planet is 1.2 degrees centigrade, and it's increasing every year as we put more and more carbon into the atmosphere. The last time that the Earth's temperature was 2 degrees centigrade warmer than pre-industrial temperatures was hundreds of thousands of years ago, during the last interglacial period. And at that point in time, the world's oceans were 16 feet higher than they are today. Let me say that again. The last time the planet saw a temperature 2 degrees higher than it has been since pre-industrial times for our recorded history, the oceans were 16 feet higher than they are today. That's what we're headed for. So this is serious business. In the Arctic, the largest contributor to sea level rise as the Arctic warms is the Greenland ice sheet. And the average annual loss of ice on Greenland has more than doubled in the last 20 years compared to the previous 20 years. That's pretty astounding. 20 years, the amount of ice melting on the Greenland ice sheet has more than doubled. And estimates on future contributions to sea level rise from the Greenland ice sheet range from 1 to 10 feet by the year 2100. And the reason why there's so much uncertainty there is because we don't know how quickly humankind can reduce its addiction to carbon and fossil fuels. the quicker we can get off of carbon and switch to renewable sources of energy, and perhaps nuclear energy as well, the lower those numbers will be. The longer we wait and the slower we achieve carbon neutrality, the higher that sea level rise will be by 2100. So it's really up to us to determine the extent of sea level rise and the extent of global warming that will occur over the next century. Can I have the next slide, please? Here's a shot of Greenland with its ice sheet. And this is a picture that depicts the extent of the ice sheet in 2019. The accelerating loss of ice that has occurred, as we've talked about just in the past 20 years, is really astounding. And the dots that you see on this picture, the larger the red dot, the more the reduction in ice from just 20 years ago. These measurements are taken on the ground, and the larger those red dots, the larger the amount of ice that's been lost. And overall, Greenland is contributing, the ice melt is contributing to about 70% of all sea level rise globally. Next slide gives you an example of the rate of ice loss on the Greenland ice sheet. So this indicates that right now, Greenland is losing about almost 281 is the exact number, but almost 300 gigatons. A gigaton is 2.2 trillion pounds. I'll say that again. A gigaton is 2.2 trillion pounds. And right now, Greenland is losing 281 gigatons of ice every year. That's astounding. Every year. And all of that freshwater runoff is going into the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic, causing some sea level rise to occur. Now, fortunately, the seas are very large on our planet. They cover about 80% of the planet. Nonetheless, over time, 600 trillion pounds a year of ice going into the sea is going to make a big difference. So the next slide, we're going to focus now on what that impact is to the United States. So you can see on this slide that sea level rise is likely to impact every coastal area in the world, but in particular here in the continental United States, we're seeing this, all of the states that have a close proximity and a shoreline that could be impacted by sea level rise. And additionally, you see the major cities of the United States that are located right on the water. Each of these cities is already at risk today from storm surges associated with extreme weather events such as hurricanes, nor'easters, and tropical storms. Lower elevation regions are in close proximity to the coast are even more vulnerable than areas of higher elevations. And these low-lying vulnerable areas include the Gulf Coast states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, the southeastern United States, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and then the northeastern states like New York and New England. So all of these vulnerable areas are highly populated, and they're right on the shoreline. And they will experience the devastating effects that sea level rise will bring as we proceed. So the next slide hones in on Florida. The first thing you notice about Florida is its enormous coastline of over 1,300 miles. And elevations all around Florida's coast are relatively low, with the average elevation being only about 3 feet. And the average elevation for the entire state of Florida, which is relatively flat, is only 6 feet. Now, there's some areas higher and some areas lower, but think about that. The average elevation throughout the state of Florida is 6 feet above sea level. The next slide shows some projections about sea level rise in Florida. So these were projections that were made by a group of independent scientists and environmentalists and climate change experts that the state of Florida contracted to do this study just a few years ago. And in 2019, these were the projections that they made for the state of Florida. And they made projections for the short term, about 20 years from now, medium term, about 50 years from now, and long term, about 100 years from now. And for each of these projections, they gave a range of the likely sea level rise that will occur. And the reason for the range, again, and we mentioned this before, the reason for the range is the uncertainty, both in the climate models that they use to make these predictions. There's some uncertainty and some difference between more conservative versus less conservative climate models, but also there's uncertainty in terms of human behavior. How quickly will we, as a species, how quickly will we be able to wean ourselves from a set of carbon economies to a non-carbon-based economy, where we switch to renewable energies that will not be emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? So that's the faster we do that, the lower the projected sea level rise in each of these timeframes, and the slower we do that, the higher these sea level rise events will be. So in the short term, just 20 years from now, it's predicted that sea level rise in Florida will rise from somewhere between 10 to 17 inches. Well, okay, can we live with that? Well, you know, the average elevation in Florida is 6 feet. The average elevation right around the coast is 3 feet. Okay, it'll be inconvenient during hurricanes because the storm surge will be even worse than it is today. But okay, we could live with that. Medium term, 50 years from now, the projections are somewhere between 21 to 54 inches. Well, 54 inches, now we're coming close to 5 feet. That means that an awful lot of the state of Florida is going to be flooded if that amount of sea level rise in fact occurs. And finally, long term, by the end of the century, 100 years from now, 2120, sea level rise is projected to go somewhere between 40 inches and 136 inches. Well, 136 inches in the worst case scenario is just over 11 feet. 11 feet is higher than the average elevation of the entire state of Florida. I mean, think about that. 100 years from now, nearly all of Florida could be submerged in a worst case scenario of sea level rise. Next slide, please. This graphic is kind of interesting, and it shows this worst case scenario along the Florida Peninsula. And again, this will be a situation that's likely to occur if greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are not abated, if we don't stop putting more greenhouse gases, primarily CO2, into the atmosphere. So vast areas of the Florida coastline will be submerged. Coastal cities of Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Tampa, St. Petersburg will all be flooded. Let's take another look at an imagined view, an artist's rendition of what Miami might look like in this scenario. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, so can you imagine vacationing in Miami 100 years from now? I don't think so. The city will be evacuated. You could not live here. It will be underwater. So, and this is just one city. And we've seen what's already happened to some of the buildings in one of the high-rise apartment buildings in Miami as a function of erosion and concrete degradation due to probably the marine environment causing rust and decay within the structural support systems for these buildings. So, I mean, this is an evolving situation. We're seeing no pun intended, the tip of the iceberg at this point, but it's going to get much, much worse. And it's incumbent on us to try to stop it. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide. And this slide shows a depiction from National Geographic showing what the Earth might look like from space if global warming is not stopped and all of the ice on the planet melted. Sea level rise would be 216 feet if all of the ice on the planet melted. Of course, this is a worst case scenario. It may never happen. Hopefully, it will never happen. But this slide also shows that, for example, Florida has been reclaimed by the sea. It has disappeared. And this is something that we have some control over. And I think this is the take-home message. You and I and our behavior and our politicians who represent us, not only here in the United States, but around the world, we all have a role to play in this, and we have to take this seriously. And if we don't rapidly switch our economies from carbon-based economies that burn fossil fuels to renewable energy-based economies that don't continue to contribute greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, if we don't do something to slow down Arctic melting and Arctic warming, which is contributing to an accelerated rate of global warming, if we don't develop technologies to actually decarbonize our atmosphere, because our atmosphere already has huge amounts of greenhouse gases that we've already put in there, that even if we stopped putting greenhouse gases in tomorrow, those greenhouse gases that are already there will continue to cause global warming for the next few decades, even if we stop today. So the clock is ticking and time is running out. And it's up to us as the species that created this problem. This is clearly man-made. If we don't do something to solve the problem, we and all of the other species that inhabit this planet will suffer dramatically and catastrophically. So it's up to us. And you know, I hate to leave you with that message. It's both scary, but it's also hopeful. Because we have control over the situation, there is some hope that we can act and act effectively and act quickly. But if we don't, the situation will be dire. And is this the legacy you want to leave for your grandchildren? I don't think so. So that's all I have.
Well,
Thank you.
Steve, I think you well answered a lot of the questions I had. I was going to ask you about, you know, what's going on with the Arctic ice melting so quickly, and you know, where's all the water going? I think that was pretty evident by a number of slides. You know, I knew that and I'm sure members of our audience also know the magnitude of the ice loss in Greenland, but I didn't know that it was to that extent. And as you said, 16 feet, 100,000 or several 100,000 years ago, when the seas were higher, and now we're talking about 270 some odd feet, if it keeps going, is just kind of astounding. I would like to ask you, since we were just on Florida, I would like to ask you, since that study you had alluded to was commissioned by the state of Florida, what is the current legislature or governor doing about the findings of their own commissioned study? What's going on?
Well, there's not much they can do except move away from the coast. You know, I mean, Florida could be a leader among states because they're going to be the most. I'm sorry, I've got some noise outside here that's I can't control. Um, Florida is one of the most vulnerable states in the union with respect to climate change and sea level rise. You would think Florida would take a very aggressive role in at least trying to reach carbon neutrality within the state as much as possible. Switch to renewable energies as much as possible. If they don't do that, they're ignoring the problem. I don't know what to say, but the only other possibility is to move away from the coast,
Right.
abandon those coastal cities, and make plans for changing the coastline.
Right. Well, so let me ask your thoughts on this with President Biden's plan to, with regard to automobiles, for his 2030 target. I'm almost kind of depressed about that now after hearing what you had to say. It's almost like that's too late. And that, coupled with what the rest of the world may or may not be doing, it doesn't sound terribly hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think our politicians have not fully grasped the gravity of the situation and the urgency of the situation. I mean, these problems are hard to solve. I mean, rebuilding our infrastructure and moving away from, the way in which we develop, produce energy, the way in which we drive our cars, the ways in which we heat our buildings. I mean, all these things will take time to change, and we understand that. Unfortunately, we didn't start doing these things and taking it seriously 20 or 30 years ago when we could have.
Right.
But lots of people didn't want to hear the bad news. Lots of people denied the science, and consequently, we didn't act. And now we're trying to play catch up. It's very late in the game. We can still do it, but we have to be very aggressive and assertive about it. And if we don't, the range of those numbers that I showed you, the longer we wait and the slower we act, the slower we are to act, the higher those sea level rise numbers will be at any given point in time. And so it's a trade-off.
So with a little bit of time that we have left, very quickly, is there sort of an over the cliff kind of projection as far as if we don't take real action by X year, that, forget it?
I would say, first of all, the clock is ticking. We don't have any time to waste. What's the drop dead date? I don't know. No one really knows. I would say we have less than 20 years to make dramatic changes in our economies across the world, and get off our fossil fuel burning habits and switch completely to non-fossil fuel sources of energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, the encouraging words, if we heed them, is we do have the power to change course, all of us collectively, if we choose to change course. And if we don't, then we have that consequence as well. As always, my friend, I really want to thank you, Steve, for joining us and enlightening our audience, and certainly enlightening me to these just really critical issues. And to our audience, if you'd like to contact Steve directly, you can email him at steve@securethefuture2100.org. Again, that's steve@securethefuture2100.org. I'm Jonathan Kleid, president of the Kleid Design Group. We are a leading provider of luxury custom cabinets in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. And if you'd like to reach me, you can certainly call our office at 415-207-6597, or go to our website, which is www.kleidgroup.com. Again, we couldn't do this program without our wonderful director, Max Killen. And remember, please go to killen.com to learn more about how Killen and Associates is helping to increase awareness of Winter of Our Discontent and President Biden's energy plan initiatives. Thank you today for joining us. Until next time, take care.